Okay, we are now live.
Excellent. I'm going to send that also to...
We can start in 2 minutes so that people can join the meeting.
Connect. I'm just going to announce it to...
Yeah, I'm going to introduce you both.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, of course, of course. Okay, let's start our meeting. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you. Jose Maria, I cannot hear you. I'm very sorry. Maybe I'm interrupting, but I think your microphone is closed.
Estaba quitado. Entonces, okay, I'm starting again because the microphone was out, so I have to start again. Okay, welcome everybody to our meeting of the faculty seminar. Thank you for coming or for attending this seminar online. I hope you can see us and hear us properly. Can you?
Yeah, now yes.
Okay. Today we are very honored to have with us Professor Ilen Michel, who is going to talk about the political sociology of European transparency, actors, instruments. Now I can read tools and citizens, okay. Professor Michel is Professor of Political Science at the University of Strasbourg. And she's also a Jean Monnet Chair-holder, Political Sociology of European Transparency. As you know, the discussion will be held by our colleague, Professor Luis Bouza, who is at home at his university and doesn't actually need any introduction. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Bouza for organizing this seminar and for inviting Professor Michel, and of course to Professor Michel for accepting the invitation and taking part in the seminar. We will follow the usual schedule of our meetings. The main presentation by Professor Michel should last about 20 or 40 or 45 minutes. Then the discussion by Professor Bouza should take him about 15 minutes, so that at 1 o'clock we should be starting the debate, which I'm sure will be really interesting. And at 2, we should be finishing our seminar. So, Professor Michel, thank you, and you can take the floor as you wish.
Buenos días a todos. Mi nivel de español no es lo suficientemente bueno como para hablar en español, así que hablaré en inglés. Dear fellow professors, dear colleagues, I'm very glad to be with you, even if only online. I would like to thank you for having invited me to speak. It is a great honor to participate in your seminar. I would like to warmly thank Luis Buza Garcia, who was keen to inform me about the work of your university and to share some discussion about the European Union. This lecture is entitled The Political Sociology of European Transparency, Actors, Tools, and Citizens, and it focuses on the research I'm conducting in the framework of my Jean Monnet chair. For almost a decade, transparency has been a very important issue, and the notion has come to be perceived as a fundamental element of a democratic governance. Efforts to promote transparency are global. Many international organizations like the OECD or the Council of Europe are interested in this notion, and it has become a staple principle of democracy. Many governments are involved in efforts to promote transparency, and they are undertaking reforms aimed at enhancing it. In this context, the European Union is not an exception, and many politicians, as well as some EU institutions, take the transparency issue very seriously. Transparency is indeed promoted as both a goal of good government practice and a means to build trust in public institutions. In general, transparency is defined as being opposed to secrecy, and it refers to a power that is open to scrutiny and to publicity in the sense of publication, disclosure. For example, President Jean-Claude Juncker stressed this issue in his first State of the Union speech in 2014, focusing on the need for democracy in order to further democracy. He said, we need to enhance fairness in our taxation policy. This requires greater transparency and equity. Later, the Commission implemented an increased level of transparency and made public key documents, including 13 legal, textual, etc. The EU's policy have ensured progress as regards respect of the rule of law, the fight against corruption, the efficiency and transparency. It talked about the transparency register as well. Before that, in 2005, José Manuel Barroso and his commissioners Siim Kallas and Margot Wallström launched the European Transparency Initiative that tried to regulate the lobbying in order to respond to the main criticism against the EU institutions. The aims of the ETI were to increase openness and accessibility to EU institutions, raise awareness over the use of the EU budget, and make the Union's institution more accountable to the public, with the intention to promote transparency in EU policymaking. These two examples show how broad the transparency notion is, and that it covers a wide variety of meanings. The website of the European Union dedicated to the transparency demonstrates this even more clearly. As you can see on the Europa website, transparency encompasses a large range of topics. You can see freedom of information, information on funding recipients, on consultation. You have information on interest representatives. You have a register on expert group members and information on former European Commissioners' authorized occupation. The various different topics listed on the transparency portal seems to be underpinned by different logics, which may be contradictory. This puzzles me. How does providing access to documents and regulating lobbying fit into the same logic? Why is fighting corruption listed along with the publication of expert groups members? Why, on the one hand, is the organization of consultations to promote dialogue with civil society seen as a means to increase transparency? Why openness is seen as a way to encourage lobbying? So transparency raises problems such as the contradiction between limiting lobbying and encouraging openness toward interest groups. It also raises the matter of definition. What does transparency mean? According to political theories, 3 types of definition can be identified. The first relates to information on the institutional process and its comprehensibility, how easy it is to understand. It constitutes a legal and constitutional point of view. This argument was developed during the early years of the European Union and later on, whenever reformers tried to improve its governance, for example, during the discussions on the white paper on governance or the better regulation agenda. The key word is procedure. That is, decisions are reached using a clear process. The second meaning is linked to this, but it refers to the availability of documents and citizens' right to know. Transparency is opposed to secrecy, and it's a means to avoid arbitrary decisions and to promote civil liberties. Transparency concerns not only political information, but also personal information on those in power, their trajectories and careers. Citizens can scrutinize those in power who have to be accountable. The third meaning is about participation of citizens and participation of civil society in the framework of the open government. The main objective is to reduce the distance between citizens and the rulers, between citizens and the institutions. What their 3 meanings have in common is publicity in the sense of publicization or disclosure through a portal with public registers or open data. Publication is supposed to be both a means to improve transparency and an objective of good government. But transparency has not always been synonymous with publication, and disclosure was not the be-all and end-all of transparency. This is why I've tried to rephrase the questions. How and why is transparency reduced to publicity, publicization, or disclosure? How does transparency become the solution to the problems of the EU institution? And what are the effects of transparency policies on citizen trust, democracy, and accountability? Does the publication of data improve the participation of citizens, improve democracy? In answering this question, I've not offered my own definition of transparency in order to assess different situations and procedures in the EU. 2 reasons can justify this. First, to comprehend the evolution of transparency, it is more useful not to define it oneself, but to study the issue of the definition of transparency. So the objective of the study is to analyze different controversies and struggles for one or other definition of transparency. Second, transparency should be observed through its uses and through the practices it enables. This is a political sociological approach I have tried to apply. What are the main advantages of such a methodology? It helps us to take the topic seriously and to avoid considering transparency tools as gadgets. Meanwhile, it allows us not to take for granted all the idle promises of transparency. Provocatively, I might say that I don't know whether transparency is a good thing, and neither do I care. It's not totally true, but I don't seek to defend and promote transparency. I just want to understand why transparency is seen as a good thing for democracy and why tools promoted for transparency's sake are used or not used. That is why I've conducted a sociological and historical inquiry on mobilization in order to identify actors who have promoted transparency within the general frame of defending democracy, and in order to analyze the uses they made of the tools provided to improve democracy. In this respect, I could explain why and how the concept of democracy can hold together such heterogeneous definitions and how the actors can deal with them to improve democracy. I could also answer the second set of questions on the consequences of democracy by examining the uses and practices of democracy devices. Looking as far back as the 1990s, I have reconstructed the history of transparency, not only through documents and policies, but also through mobilization. The mobilization concerned, on the one side, NGOs and civic associations, and on the other side, the EU institution and some European staff who were eager to reform the EU institution. I could observe two different configurations where transparency has been dealt with. At different times, the actors promoting transparency were not the same ones, and their definition of transparency was different. In the 1990s, the main concern for EU staff was the issue of the comprehensibility of the institutions and the clarity of the decision-making process. In the early years of the European Union, EU staff focuses on the issue of good administration and access to documents. The theoretical framework is a legal conception with the right to know, the right to have fair treatment, equal opportunities. Within these institutions, you have a part of the EU civil servant of the European institution who try to organize themselves in order to provide information to journalists, to citizens about decision-making, about regulations, decision, who is who, and so on. Transparency consisted of institutional issues with various measures guaranteeing the right of access, such as Regulation 1049. And institutions such as the European Ombudsman. At that time, the issue of lobbying was missing. It was not an issue for these actors. They are not concerned with it because it was not a matter of rights. It was not central to the organization or the functioning of EU institutions, it was a separate question. For example, the European Ombudsman was working on its mandate and tried to clarify its scope of intervention. What is maladministration? Who can complain? Against what? But it did not examine the case of lobbying or interest group, whereas today it is the core issue of its mandate with conflict of interest and revolving door. Furthermore, the European Ombudsman did not consider the issue of financial fraud. This was considered as a criminal issue, not an administrative issue. Thus, at that time, the issue of transparency was reduced to the question of the right of access to document, and to the question of information about the decision-making process. NGOs operating in the European field also focuses on citizens' rights. For them, democracy was considered as a set of rights for citizens. For example, the right to vote and to be elected for citizens from a member state living in another member state with the European citizenship. The right to complain about EU institutions, thanks to the Ombudsman. This right was seen as a good protection against abuse of power by EU institutions. So they argued for more democracy through more rights. And they remain in favor of European integration. Many are federalists or eager to create a real supranational European system where citizens can express themselves and make their voice heard. Many of them thought to promote civil society and were very active during the beginning of the 2000s and within the discussion about the white paper on European governance with the participation of civil society. In the mid-2000s, the configuration changed. The context became more tense after the failure of the various referendums. The constitutional project was not well accepted. Many NGOs acted to promote an alternative Europe, similar to previous alternative movements, such as Porto Alegre, for example, or counter summits. They organized campaigns against European integration. They criticized European institutions and the way they function. They denounced privileged access to the institutions and the influence of industrial groups. To establish the facts, they conduct wide inquiries, they exposed scandals and published bad stories on EU staff and lobbyists. Like others in the 90s, they demand democracy, but their objective was quite different and the means to achieve it were noisier. Their mobilization was against rather than in favor of European integration. For example, Corporate Europe Observatory and Alter EU, the Alliance for Lobbying Transparency and Ethics Regulations, raised the problems of opacity and secrecy. They believed transparency could help to achieve better institutions and better processes. In this context, EU institutions were challenged and asked to do something to respond to the critics. At the beginning of Barroso's term, Siim Kallas and Margot Wallström were aware of the EU's critique, and they wanted to regain citizens' trust. The demands of CEO and Alter EU were taken seriously, especially the demand for more transparency. But at the same time, the commissioners pursued their own agenda regarding the reform of EU institutions in the continuation of the task force on better regulation or on the white paper on governance. They wanted to tackle financial fraud, following the Center Commission's resignation. They want to continue with financial fraud reform. They organize monitoring and scrutiny of funds granted by the EU. So in the 2000s, transparency consisted in revelations and the fight against privilege and fraud. The question of publicization was seen as a good way of dealing with the problem. And this objective seemed to be widely shared by both sides. On the one hand, NGO would be pleased because EU institutions launched the European initiative to organize lobbying and to promote access to documents about the legislative process. On the other hand, EU institutions could count on NGOs' mobilization to make transparency a more visible issue and more central to the reform of institutions and decision-making. That's how they converge. With the European Transparency Initiative, both the reformers and critical NGOs could seemingly pursue a common goal. However, for NGOs, transparency is a means to reveal the problem and make citizens aware of it. But for EU staff, transparency is a finality in itself. Once information is made public, the objective is reached. The hope is that disclosure will change practices, and it could do it at low cost. But is it enough? Is it efficient? So by the end of 2000s, transparency was covered entirely by these disclosure objectives, which satisfy both the administration and NGOs. A new direction has been taken with the extension of this priority to access to decision-making. After the right to know, here is the action of making known by disclosure. So let's examine the effect of the publicity measure. Different effects can be observed, both on the practices and on the general conception of democracy. The first one is rather paradoxical. Why? Because the more data is published, the more criticism is fueled. Indeed, transparency is a response to critics, but it is not a response to regain trust. Transparency is a means to provide information, but it is not enough. It remains very important to process data in order to convey information. For example, with such a public register, citizens discover lobbying as a huge phenomenon that is seen as increasing. For example, you have this figure, but it is the identification of lobbyists that is increasing. However, it could make some organizations claim to be lobbyists, whereas previously they would be registered as associations or civil society organizations. So the register can't tell us if the lobbying is increasing. It can show that many peoples and organizations are considered as lobbyists. And when you see, wow, 12,000 registrants in the register, wow, so many, does it regain trust? Beyond the publication of data, we must ask, what for? Indeed, much data is published, but it isn't processed. However, data is not information. That's why journalists, NGOs, even researchers have to do the job. But they analyze data with their own objectives and their own agenda. For example, for CEO, the data they published often have the effect of a revelation. As far as revolving door phenomenon is concerned, the data they published raise the question of the measurement of the phenomenon. Are the revolving door cases they examine representative of general trends, or are they just atypical examples thrown into the limelight to help them to defend their cause? Considering the lack of systematic quantitative data, it is hard to say, much as it is also hard to assess whether it affects commissioners more than MEPs, some nationalities more than others, the younger generations more than those recently retired from administrative and political positions. So, on the other hand, according to EU institutions, transparency is a goal, and they try to provide more and more data and more publications. But what is at risk is that too much data kills information. The relevant information is hidden in many publications. This second effect deals with the question of using. Who is using public data? Which interests are served by publication of data and disclosure? Again, I take the example of the transparency register. What do lobbyists do? Most of them try to be on the register, because not to be registered is not existing. They want to be in it. At the beginning of the European Transparency Initiative, consultancies were reluctant to register, but they realized it was a good advertising to be registered. This device might provide them some clients. And furthermore, they can see who the other lobbyists are and with whom they are working. So step by step, more and more actors agree to register, even if all don't provide exact data, especially as far as financial information is concerned. Even among lawyers who wanted to keep their professional secrets, registration is considered to be fine. So we must ask whether the transparency register is a new sort of advertising. And it is the same with the publication of meetings by MEPs. According to European Parliament rules, MEPs are expected to publish their meetings on the website. Meetings with lobbyists or meetings with academic organization and so on, but not all MEPs agree. Those who do agree are proud to say they did it, and they can show off in order to make the difference from the others. Publicization of information is a distinctive device that enables them to say they are transparent where their adversaries are not. And you can have the difference between those who accept, who agree to publish with past meeting, and those who disagree. They use the publication of meetings as a strategic self-presentation to show how democratic they are and to show they have nothing to hide. And it is the same with the register of gift. The question remains, what can we do with all the data collected and published? And do we really use it? And what for? This question raises the question of the cost of transparency. It is time consuming, it costs money, and what for? The main criticisms against transparency are about the bureaucratic cost to fill in forms and update the data. This criticism is shared with the institutions concerned that provide few resources to manage registers. They want transparency, but they don't provide enough resources to manage it. For example, there are only 4 persons working at the Secretariat of the Transparency Register. How can they monitor the data and verify them? That is why they tend to delegate the scrutiny and verification of the data to NGOs. Of course, they cannot say it publicly, but they agree when I ask them whether NGOs are helping them to do the job. If the NGOs don't help the administration, it can't manage it because of the lack of resources. In order to end this presentation with a more optimistic touch, I take a last example with the inquiry I conducted on conflict of interest management in France. It is related to another study on the European Medicines Agency. I focused on physicians and their ties with pharmaceutical firms. In France, in 2011, after health scandals, a law has been passed to fight conflict of interest. Physicians are expected to declare their interest, and the pharmaceutical industry is expected to disclose all the advantage and gift they provide to them on a public database. Thanks to this database on physicians, with my colleagues, I tried to assess the impact of these new rules on the recruitment of physicians within expert committees. I showed that this disclosure procedure did produce a change in the choice of experts. Since 2017, when the database was set up, members of the committee have had structurally fewer industry links, or at least fewer evident and declared links. Despite this, they are no less scientifically reputable than those who came before them. On the contrary, on entering the committee, their scientific reach appears broader. So in recruiting experts who are less linked to the industry, those responsible for their selection have succeeded in putting an end to the correlation between closer industry links and better scientific reputation. This transformation of experts' profiles due to tighter control on potential conflict of interest is probably not the only effect, but this disclosure procedure combines with internal rules to prevent conflict of interest in health agencies is not responsible for a drop of the quality of experts and the eviction of the excellence among them, as it is often claimed, but not demonstrated. So time is running. Oops. Conclusion. Does transparency promote changes within democracy? First, it brings about changes in practices with unexpected consequences and strategic uses of disclosure. And secondly, transparency also changes conceptions of democracy. It's stressed on different should be based procedures instead of elections that are relegated to second line. You have a good example with impact assessment that was supposed to help the decision maker to make up their mind with facts and figures. But political decision is not fact and figures, but discussions on the general objective and the conception of society, equality, and economics. So with transparency, legitimacy, but through procedure instead of election. Another effect is that democracy is rather based on scrutiny than on election with transparency, with a stress on providing data instead of discussing collectively on them, the making of indicators and the uses of information provided. So transparency can't be reduced to publicization and disclosure. It is not enough. Otherwise, the risk is that transparency is nothing but a second best option for democracy, reduced to this minimal requirement, which is the only one possible when elections, public debate, and shared decision-making have disappeared. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Michel. Luis, when you want, you can start your discussion. Thank you, Professor Michel, for your excellent presentation. It was really, really interesting.
Thank you, Jose Maria. I hope you can hear me all well. We had a few issues at the beginning with my microphone, but I hope it is working fine now. I rejoin Jose Maria. Thanks a lot, Hélène, for the very interesting presentation. Overall, colleagues, you are all going to see that I strongly agree with what Hélène has presented. So I am not going to take a very frontal discussion, but I will be emphasizing 4 points on maybe things I know Hélène is interesting and maybe she has emphasized a bit less, and also what all of that implies for both public debate currently in Spain and also current research. So what can we sort of take home for ongoing debates? Now, before starting, I also wanted to point out and I think that what Hélène has presented and what she's doing is very original, because as she said at the beginning, it looks suspicious if you have anything critical to say about transparency. And it doesn't mean that you don't want transparency, but I think the point that most of us will make is that transparency is not necessarily the solution to all the problems that our polities face, right? And I think this is part of the problem of the framing and also the breadth of the solutions that have been adopted. So I think that this critical approach, critical in the sense of looking how it works, who benefits from it, and what is at stake is certainly something that we need. So just to be clear, I start with a very strong rejoinder of what Hélène is doing. Now I'm going to make comments on 4 points. One is what is at stake in relation with transparency. I think Hélène has been very clear on this, that when we apply that, for instance, to Spain, there are probably other elements that can be connected to these practices of why transparency is promoted, what demands are being made in relation to transparency. 2, I am going to be coming back to the issue of the breadth on how broad the definition of transparency has been, all the different logics that are connected, and also say a word about also the type of coalitions that have promoted transparency. 3, I'm going to be looking at the assumptions behind transparency, and this connects both to the issue of resources and to the model of democracy that is being promoted. And finally, a question that I know Hélène and some colleagues have been asking, and I think this is still very much up for grabs and debate, but to what extent is there a sort of trickle-down effect from Brussels to the member states in relation to transparency? So to start with my first point on the stake, I think Hélène has been very clear. What is at stake is a certain procedural definition of democracy. There has been also a very clear evolution of the topic from the 90s through the 2000s to the current moment. So we have a common framing or stable framing of transparency, but the concrete meaning and the concrete practices have de facto changed with time. So this is, I think, something very important to point out. Now, I think there is another issue that is maybe not so important at the EU level, but is probably very important in countries like Spain and probably France, which is, I think, related to the objectivation and legitimation of the profession of lobbyist. This was probably true in Brussels as well, still in the 90s and 2000s, but this objectivation and legitimation of the profession of lobbyist has been done much more clearly and much more upfront, if you can say that, I think, by the European Commission in the 1990s. The European Commission has been much more vocal about saying lobbying is legitimate, lobbying can be good, it is a way of obtaining information for the public. Now, if you look at the current debates in Spain, for instance, and this is something Spanish lobbyists hate, but usually regulation of lobbies is linked to transparency. They like that, but at the same time, it is also linked to fighting corruption. And this is something they like less in terms of framing. Why do I make this point? Because precisely it looks like the regulator, the legislator, would be critical of lobbying and that you need to regulate lobbying in order to create fences. However, when you look at who is behind the campaigns to regulate lobbying, it looks like it is the lobbyists themselves. So it is, the impression you have is that they are lobbying for regulation. In the end, I have to admit that it will be linked to the suspicion related to them, but they are still obtaining what they want, which is regulation. So the question is, why do they expect this regulation? And here I rejoin what Elaine was saying. Elaine was mentioning, for instance, the importance of visibility, etc. This is probably also going on in a country like Spain, but even more importantly, it allows you to obtain recognition for your professional practice. This is something that is normalized in the political system that was maybe not so normalized before. So this is where this procedural dimension becomes very important. If you do things right, so meaning if you register yourself, if you commit yourself to the deontological code and so on, then you can, you are entitled to access the public discussion. And this is something I think very important for a discussion like the one we are having between law and politics. It is assumed that if you do things right from the procedural point of view, lobbying even becomes part of the exercise of political participation. You are no longer carrying out a professional exercise, you are exerting a fundamental right. So I think that this perspective on trying to understand what is at stake when you regulate lobbying and when you opt for transparency as a regulation is something very important. Now, my second point on the very broad dimension, I entirely agree with Hélène, and this is again something we are also seeing in other contexts. Transparency is a broad issue for right to access documents, regulating lobbying, enhancing participation, and even regulating public markets. So this is a very broad notion. And I think, for instance, in Spain, it is even also this very explicit framing of the fight against corruption. So I'm not going to discuss what Hélène has said on this point. I entirely agree. I was also wondering from a sociological point of view, this is half question, half comment. What do we know about the kind of coalitions? What kind of factors are promoting this dimension? Because I think the assumption or the departure point of view that we can have as researchers is that if we see these very broad definitions, it's probably because you also have very broad demands coming from the demand side, that probably you have relatively disparate demands that in the end are all framed together under this big umbrella of transparency. And I think this is related to what you were saying about the NGOs that were very critical of the Commission of lobbying in the early 2000s. But I think, and this is a genuine question, for instance, Justin Greenwood argued that these organizations become much closer to the Commission in around 2007 with the first initiative on transparency, and that they actually cooperated with the Commission. And what is fascinating for me is that actually some of these organizations have become political entrepreneurs at the transnational level to promote transparency where it didn't exist. So for instance, Alter, EU, Transparency International, and so on have sort of coalesced to promote transparency in other EU member states. They grade member states according to their degree of transparency. So I think that probably what we also see is this transnationalization of a campaign to promote transparency as a broad solution for a certain model of democracy. Now, my third point, what are the assumptions behind transparency? I think there is something very important that Ellen has mentioned, maybe, well, very important. It may have sounded like a detail, but I think it is very telling about the model of democracy that is behind, which is the issue of resources devoted to checking the register. I think Ellen mentioned there are now four employees, for commission officials checking the register. This is probably a big increase in proportion to what was back in 2011, right, when there was only one person checking the register. Now, of course, I'm kidding. This is still very little, but probably the assumption behind this is a very pluralistic one, which is, and it connects again to the question of the importance of procedure. It is, if you agree to be on a public register, then this is everything you have to do, because in the end, there is an assumption that the public, meaning the public from sort of ordinary citizens, and I know Professor García-Guitián is going to have something to say about this ordinary citizen later on, but everyone from the ordinary citizen to the professionalized NGO to the rival of the concrete lobbyist can go and check what you are doing. So from the moment you register, all incentives to not behave properly have disappeared, right? And I think it is this very core assumption that someone will be caring and someone will be checking that needs to be deconstructed, because, and in particular for the European Union, assuming that someone is paying attention is probably a big leap forward in the understanding of the European Union. Is really someone checking? Is there something like a European public opinion checking? Well, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I would say probably most of the time is no. So who is checking the register at the same time? I here agree with Hélène, the NGO. So in the end, you have two stakes. On the one hand, you have the lobbyists demanding to be recognized as a profession. On the other hand, you have the NGOs asking to have a tool to do their job of controlling the lobbies. So this is where you somehow have a very disparate and maybe not even a formal coalition, but a convergence of two different interests to promote transparency. What is the risk, I think, behind this assumption? And here again, I'm looking at the sort of trickle-down effect from Brussels, is when you apply similar solutions in other member states, because most of the literature agrees that, well, we have something like a very pluralistic environment in Brussels, so it made sense to go for regulation, right? Now, when you apply that in countries like certainly Spain, and I think probably also France, and they would even dare to say Germany, that either have a relatively statist or corporatist system, you are de facto introducing a massive change in the regulation model. You are going from this neo-corporatist with all the problems that the neo-corporatist models may have to a pluralistic solution without transition. So you are introducing a pluralistic solution without a pluralistic society, assuming that in a country like Spain, you're going to have public opinion, professional journalists, and NGOs actually checking what lobbyists do, is, I think, a big assumption. I think that we would need much more help for civil society to actually follow up these kind of registers than we actually have. So this is where I think that in the end, this very procedural notion that once you are registered, you are committed to the public good is to be taken with critical eyes. And finally, my question, and I know this is something that is not necessarily very clear and probably requires more research, but to what extent, I mentioned several times that we are seeing similar revolutions in Spain. Now, my question and my comment would be, I think this is linked to what is going on in Brussels. And I go back to my first point, because I think what is at stake in some cases is also the recognition and the objectivation of the profession of lobbyist, if you look at who has been promoting that, at least in the case of Spain, many of the top lobbyists that go public and saying we need to regulate our profession have actually been in Brussels or in London, so in countries or in political systems where you have already this kind of solutions. So if you connect that to what I was saying before about the type of coalitions that we have seen and the Transparency Internationals and so on, it starts to look like you have a sort of transnational political entrepreneurs that go around doing checklists of transparency and having recommendations for government. Now, why is that wrong? I'm not saying it's wrong. I just rejoined the position of Hélène. It's not wrong, but there's probably something at stake. Now, how could that be relatively dangerous? I think just two broad comments. I already mentioned the risk of imposing pluralist solutions in societies that don't have pluralist balances prior. I would still add maybe two issues. One of the risks of this procedural solutions is that you go for a sort of checklist democracy. If you do what this transnational alliance of promoters of transparency recommend you, they will stop criticizing you. So you have some incentives to adopt a very procedural understanding of democracy without actually doing the, if you want, the deep transformations or the deep commitment of resources to make sure that it works. And secondly, and maybe that's even more of a risk, because in some cases, evaluation of public policies, externalization of public policies, all this idea that managerial public administrations are the ones carrying out this type of transparency. There is also a risk that the ones who are making recommendations for how to adapt your system to transparency requirements are also the ones who are advising you on how to actually carry out your reform. So in the end, it is not only an exercise in, if you want, honest lobbying or exercising your right to give your opinion on how the system would be. You're also creating a market for transparency and transparency reform when you are promoting this. I don't know to what extent this is something that we can observe, or if this is maybe too big a leap. But as I said, I think all my comments really go just in the direction of what Professor Michel was pointing out. I just wanted to maybe know a bit more about this and discuss to what extent can we apply that to other European political systems. So thanks a lot, Hélène.
Thank you, Professor Botha, for your interesting 4 points. I think now we can start the debate. Is there anybody who wants to ask any questions or to make any comments?
Yes, I would like.
Elena, welcome. I knew you were there.
Yes. Can you see me?
I saw you among the
the public.
Elena, you're welcome.
Wait.
Yeah, we see you, Elena.
Elena.
You cannot see me yet? Okay.
Yeah,
More or less.
We do see you now.
Okay. I'm using these new, I don't know how, earphones, and so I'm not sure how they work.
They look nice.
Okay, yes. It's for not listening the washing machine that is nearby. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I want to ask just a few questions because, of course, these are topics I've been working with and talking with Luis Botha for a long time. So I share his comments and observations about that, and we share some of the experiences with these lobbyists and politicians working on that. So I will just start with a question that I think is very important. You said before that at the end, these discourses are in a way consecrating a procedural definition of democracy. And I disagree on this because I think it's all this interest on transparency of course, it has evolved in, at least in European countries. And I would like also to talk a little bit about what happened in the States and the experience of the United States. That will be my second comment. But I think all these discourses and narratives on transparency that are linked also with open government, etc., e-democracy, and etc., what they stress is that they are giving a new role to citizens. So they are very linked to a discourse about citizen participation that is based on I would say, a dichotomy of, representative systems as considered very elitist, and trying to find out new ways of giving this role to the citizens. You can see it on the discourses of the lobbies. I had the chance to participate as external advisor on these reports of Transparency International in Spain, and we had the representatives of the lobbies. And the first argument for their claim to be regulated is that they are increasing citizen participation. So they present themselves as, some mediators of the citizens, but that have a special or different legitimation than the politicians. So it's very important to take in account that, because also for many citizens, there is the belief that, this transparency can generate a direct access of the ordinary citizens. And Luis, I again go back to this idea of the ordinary citizens. This is what, for example, an advisor of MP in the European Parliament was telling me about. And she was saying, well, my father is already retired, and she has to be willing to follow real politics. So all these discourses, is the promise that they will help to close the gap with the citizens. That, I think, this is the strong narrative that is behind this. Of course, these experiences and these discourses, and there are other versions, of course, of this interest. And my second, more than comment, is going to be a question is, of course, we have had the experience of the United States and other countries as Canada of trying to regulate the lobbies with these transparency registers. And the outcome is as discouraging as always have been. I remember this report made by the Bar Association of the United States that gave to Obama, that was very interested on promoting this open government and adopted this discourse. And this is not a regulation as understood by citizens in the sense of really controlling the effect of citizens. It has other effects, and I think Luis commented it on his presentation, but we shouldn't, we should in a way, how is in English, demystify in a way the role of these registers and really go further in this type of research that Eleni is doing and showing the real effect of all these discourses. And it's not, of course, that I'm against transparency, but I'm against like putting transparency as a kind of normative ideal that is going to solve all the problems democracies have in this moment. For the moment, it's fine.
Elena, these were questions or comments, or do you want an answer?
Well, if they want to comment, it's fine.
Yeah, okay. Professor Michel?
Yes, thank you for all your comment. Very interesting, Luis and Elena, for your question. I just want to respond to Elena, because I agree, narratives on transparency are important, but what I said is it's not enough. And if you don't have any mobilization or association of people to mobilize citizens, they won't be more interested than they are at that time, because some data are published on website. So political participation is not as up. You have transparency, you can open a website and you can participate. It's more complicated than this, you know that. And my point is a bit critics with the EU institutions, that they consider they did the job, they provide data, they publish website, and it's enough. So, but your comment raised another question. It is about who are the NGOs or citizens association. Who are those who are who can or are enabled to access data, to examine it and to interpret it, and in order to make politics, in order to make participate citizens. So this is very important, and I agree. We need intermediaries, we need a political entrepreneur, and maybe associations, but maybe political parties, maybe politicians, maybe, I don't know.
Professor Botha, thank you, Professor Mitchell. Luis, we can't hear you.
No, I didn't say anything because I thought Elaine wanted to say something else.
Okay,
yes,
okay.
I wanted to say some word about the lobbyist register, and because Luis raised very interesting point. The paradox of this register is the register recognize lobbying as professional activity. So it's not a problem, but the question is not, is lobbying is legitimate or not? But the question becomes, what is good lobbying or bad lobbying? So the lobbying is, okay, there is lobbying, everybody is lobbying. So let's look at who is acting properly and who is not. And the second effect of the register is that the lobbying is considered as an individual practice. And in the work I conduct previously, I showed lobbying is a structural phenomenon encouraged by the functioning of institutions and the European integration. So because of the European Commission needs to have constituencies and needs to have allies, and so they encourage enrolled interest groups in order to defend the European integration. But now, with a good thing or bad thing, the lobbyist is an individual phenomenon, and the question is ethical and not longer political. So that's an effect or consequences of this kind of device. I agree with the pluralistic solution, and I didn't think about this, but you made me aware of that. With the register, all interest groups are welcome, and the more interest groups are, the more democracy in a pluralistic way is fine, because the problem was considered as a bias or a privilege. So if you multiply the number of groups, the access, the types of lobbyists, you have a part of the solution. And it's very interesting in that way to figure out the register.
And actually, if I may jump in again on this point, and maybe also to relate something that Elena was mentioning, it's probably also the connection with participation that changes the political balance and also the political and administrative balance in the sense that regulating lobbying is also making a decision about the kind of interaction that you will have with society. Before, if you don't regulate lobbying, the assumption, and again, that's probably up for a big discussion, but the assumption is that it is the responsibility of the administration, the responsibility of legislator to actively consult society in order to achieve a balanced discussion, right? That you need to gather, that you need to actively look for who needs to be consulted. Now, if you regulate lobbying, what you're telling society is actually everyone has a right to be involved, and they have also defined mechanisms for participation. So actually, the sort of the weight of the evidence, to say it in this way, who needs to actively be informed changes because you have procedural definitions of democracy and you have participation. Then you are no longer necessarily, as an administration, you no longer necessarily have to find the representative actors of society to be involved in the decision. Everyone is supposed to be informed, and if there's an unbalanced mobilization, then this is pluralism, right? That not everyone is interested in something at the same time. So this is where I see that there's a deeper transformation of democracy, and here this broad definition of transparency related to participation is probably even more paradoxical. You are just creating the opportunity, but it doesn't mean that necessarily society will be in the same degree of mobilization.
Thank you, Luis.
Maybe I interrupt you, Ellen, if you wanted to add anything else.
No, you didn't. I'd like to address a question to either of you both, Professor Michel, Professor Botha. Is there any major difference regarding practice and regulation of transparency between Europe and the United States? I don't mean small differences, but something relevant. So I can pose the question other way. Has American politics been the model to imitate in Europe, or has Europe invented anything new, the concept of transparency or means in order to achieve transparency? Who started this? Who started transparency? America or Europe?
Do you want to answer, Luis?
This is a difficult one, so I'm still thinking. I may have one of the things to say, but no. Hélène, I think, knows that much better than me, but I would say in relation to lobbying regulation, there's one big difference, which is we tend to assume that in both of them, there's a regulation of lobbying, actually both in the Congress of the United States and in the European Parliament and Commission. There is a significant discussion, which is the American register is a mandatory one. The sanctions are quite heavy. It can even have criminal consequences. The European register has been tightened with the years, but correct me, Hélène, if I'm wrong, but it still remains a voluntary one. So, of course, you have a very strong pressure to register, but there are no major consequences if you don't register, other than the reputational ones, which of course are important, but of no comparison to the United States. I think this is probably one big difference, and I think this probably also begs another question, and probably also interesting for colleagues in the legal research, which is why also did the European Commission opt for this voluntary solution? I have always thought it probably has to do with the very diversity of European societies. Probably in order to have a very strong relation of lobbying, you need, on the one hand, a very strong legitimacy. You need to be able to tell people, I'm going to open a legal case against you for not registering. Also, that you have a very diverse set of solutions at the European level, right? So I think this is probably one of the issues. And then where did it come? Is there any evidence of American lobbying? I think Justin Greenwood argued that to some extent, yes, there were some American activists and American lobbyists active in promoting the solution. But I have always thought that there was a closer model in Europe, which was the UK. The UK also opted for transparency more or less at the same time. So you also have quite a big lobbying industry in London that was probably active in the solution. So it probably an US influence that some more or less traveled through London, but that again, I think I'm speculating more than actually answering the question.
Thank you, Luis.
I don't know if the American register was considered as a model, but all the European agents and lobbyists knew the American register, so they can argue for or against and try to manage modification or amendment. And the difference is about mandatory, voluntary, but also about the data provided by the lobbyists who register. On the European register, you don't have any information on financial data. You have so vague and general information, so it's useless. But at the US, I think it's more precise on the finance. And this raised the question, I think, Luis, you asked it, about the influence of the EU register on the member states. And I know there is a debate, for example, with my colleague Guillaume Courty, who studied the French case and the law about registering lobbying and fight against corruption, etc. Sapin 2, number 2. And he argued that there is no influence from the EU level to the French level. And because he didn't find any argument with European model or a European phrase, and the actor were French without any experience in the European field. So he said there's no direct influence. But I'd like to add that even if there's no direct influence from the EU level on the French level, there is an international influence made by the OECD, the organization that established guidelines and a ranking of states, and they look at the government in Europe. France is the last government without any legislation, or look at this, the first state. So with such publications, the pressure on government is seized by NGOs or other political entrepreneurs to achieve their goal and to make the government pass laws or make decisions in their sense. So I think there is a diffuse influence, not from the EU, but from the OECD or international organization that eager to encourage member states to establish criteria, tools, device in order to say, look at this country, it's very transparent. This one, not much. This a very bad student in the classroom of the European member state.
It's a bit of the name and shame, right?
Yeah,
you are not
exactly.
doing. You're a bit of a laggard. In relation to the OECD, you mentioned that at the beginning, and I forgot to ask. I saw there was, I think it was in 2019, a sort of agreement between the European Union and the OECD to promote better regulation guidelines. I don't know if this is something that you have been working on, but I think it is very interesting because what I really liked is what you said about transparency and how broadly it has been defined is very similar to the other, or to the field I work more on, which is participation. Participation has been defined in very broad terms. You have had the stable notion of transparency of participation, which has been changing with time. And since 2006, you have these better regulation guidelines that have been brought closer and closer to mechanisms of participatory democracy. So I think this is a very interesting subject. So how to what extent is there this convergence of transparency as a political principle with better regulation as a neo-managerial practice in Europe and as a result of the OECD?
I think it's a question of circulation of notion and actors, because actors are a member of a committee at the OCDE and in their member state, and goes to discuss with EU staff, and it's the circulation of an idea of concept is related, is linked with the circulation of actors, and we can observe it. For example, at the beginning of the development of transparency, you have you have some specialists, experts who deal with Transparency International, for example, and meet together with other EU staff. And so it's like a community of actors who want to make changes, and it's and they can do it by cumulate positions within government, within expert groups, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But this cumulativity of positions is a good explanation of this circulation and the spread of a notion like transparency or participation, as you studied.
Okay, anything else? Okay, if there isn't anything else, we can finish our seminar now. I think it's Elena. Elena, you have to turn on your microphone. Your microphone on, Elena. Elena, we can't hear you. Elena, can you try to turn on your microphone?
Perdona, como hay dos Elenas, no me estáis diciendo a mí, ¿no? Porque ya estoy...
Ah, sí. Pues solo te estoy... I'm only talking to you.
Ah, okay. Sorry.
Because we see a yellow square on your name, so we thought you wanted to say something.
I thought I thought you were trying to say something. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's fine.
Oh,
sorry.
Okay, thank you, Elena. Sorry. Sorry. Then we can finish this seminar. I think it's time for me to say thank you again to Professor Mitchell and Professor Botha for your excellent presentations, and to all of you for coming or being there online, and for your questions and your comments. And it's also time for me to say goodbye. Ciao. We will meet up again on May the 20th. The next seminar will be on la construcción del Estado Constitucional, 40 años de Ley Orgánica del Tribunal Constitucional. And the speakers will be Manuel Aragón, as you know, Pedro Cruz, and Álvaro Rodríguez Bereijo. Thank you for being there. Thank you for your presentations. Ciao.
Thank you very much for organizing this, Maria and Julia, and thanks, Len, for being there from Strasbourg, and hopefully we can meet in person soon.
Yes, thank you very much for the attendees and your invitation, and it was a pleasure to discuss about transparency with you. Thank you.
It was our pleasure. It was our pleasure.